Tonight, we're diving into one of the most chaotic, thrilling, and downright unpredictable reigns in all of European history. Imagine a king whose every decision sent ripples, no, waves, across an entire continent. A man whose personal desires weren't just scandalous but reshaped religion, rewrote political alliances, and toppled ancient institutions. This is not the story of some background monarch who signed a few papers and lived a quiet life in a castle. No, this is the story of King Henry VIII, a ruler who shattered centuries-old traditions because he simply refused to hear the word no. And by the time we reach the end of this saga, you'll be amazed that England even survived his rule at all. So grab your blanket, settle in, and let's drift back to an England very few would dare visit if given the choice. And hey, while you're here, don't forget to smash that like button, subscribe for more wild stories from history, and tell me where you're watching from. It's always incredible to see where in the world you all are tuning in from. The year is 1512. You wake up to the sounds of wooden carts rumbling over uneven cobblestone streets, the air thick with the mixed aroma of burning timber, damp straw, and the not-so-pleasant stench of animal droppings baking under the weak English sun. The streets are narrow, winding like a tangled web through neighborhoods packed with low wooden homes leaning toward each other, as if conspiring in whispered gossip. Livestock roam freely, pigs rooting through trash, chickens flapping past, barefoot children darting between puddles of mud and waste. Hygiene is less science and more superstition. The River Thames flowing nearby has transformed into a sluggish, foul-smelling open sewer, carrying London's refuse downstream, its waters darker than the night sky. At the center of this gritty world stands a young monarch who has just ascended the throne. Henry, only 18 years old, stands head and shoulders above most of his subjects. He's taller than nearly anyone you'll meet in the kingdom, stretching up to nearly 6 feet 4 inches with broad shoulders and a striking presence that commands attention the moment he enters a room. His face is framed by thick waves of auburn hair, his skin flushed with the vigor of youth, his blue eyes gleaming with the confidence only absolute power can bestow. Where most kings might still be learning how to govern, Henry is already throwing himself into the role with the energy of a man possessed. But this isn't the tired image of the overweight, brooding Henry we so often picture. No, this Henry is vibrant. His mornings are spent hunting deer in the royal forests, afternoons filled with intense games of tennis or displays of jousting that leave entire courts breathless. When evening comes, he dazzles audiences with his mastery of the lute, his rich singing voice filling the grand halls, accompanied by his skillful playing. Fluent in several languages, Henry can debate theology with the clergy one moment and discuss the finer points of poetry the next. He is in every sense a Renaissance prince, and the people adore him for it. His queen at this point is Eleanor of Navarre, a deeply devout woman from one of Spain's neighboring kingdoms, originally married to Henry's older brother Lionel, who tragically died just months after their wedding. To preserve political alliances, Henry married Eleanor himself. She is 6 years his senior with sharp intellect, impeccable manners, and a formidable reputation for piety and grace. Wherever she goes, commoners bow their heads in reverence and the nobility watch their words carefully in her presence. Eleanor is no idle decoration in court. She engages in statecraft alongside her husband, offering counsel rooted in both faith and diplomacy. Life for the average citizen, however, couldn't be more different. If you were born a peasant, odds are you'll never travel more than 10 miles from your birthplace. Your home is little more than a timber skeleton filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of clay, straw, and dung, designed to keep the worst of the weather at bay, but never truly warm or dry. The thatched roof above your head leaks during storms, and rodents skitter freely within the walls. You share the space with your extended family, sleeping side by side on straw mattresses, with livestock occupying one corner of the room during the cold months. Your diet consists primarily of coarse bread made from rye and barley, thick soups called broths, and the occasional bit of salted meat if you've been fortunate that week. Fresh fruits and vegetables are rare and seasonal, and your teeth are ground down by the gritty flour laced with bits of stone from the local mill. Medical care is practically non-existent. If illness strikes, you pray to the saints for mercy, because the village healer's potions are often more superstition than science. Yet despite these harsh realities, The rhythm of your life moves in step with the church calendar. Nearly every facet of daily existence revolves around religious observance. Monasteries serve as hospitals, orphanages, and places of learning. The parish priest is both spiritual leader and the community's link to the wider world. The church bells ring out to mark births, marriages, and deaths, the inescapable cycle of life. Meanwhile, in his first few years on the throne, Henry is spending like there's no tomorrow. His father, the late Henry VII, had pinched every penny, hoarding a fortune through heavy taxation and careful diplomacy. But young Henry sees that treasure not as something to protect, but as fuel for his vision of majesty. He orders new palaces to be constructed, existing ones expanded and redecorated with lavish tapestries and gilded ceilings that reflect candlelight and glittering patterns across the stone walls. His wardrobe is overflowing with silk, velvet, and fur-lined garments adorned with precious stones. Banquets grow more elaborate, with towering displays of roasted peacocks, swans dressed in their own feathers, and pies hiding entire flocks of songbirds inside. The court itself transforms into a glittering theater of extravagance. Musicians play throughout the day, dancers perform intricate routines, and nobles jostle for the king's favor in whispered backroom dealings. If you're lucky enough to dine at court, you feast on courses that stretch long into the night. Roasted venison, honey-glazed ducks, freshwater fish, exotic spices brought from distant trade routes, over 9,000 sheep, 2,500 deer, and countless barrels of imported wine vanish into the endless appetite of Henry's royal household each year. As the celebrations continue, Henry's political ambition grows. He plunges England into the great chessboard of European politics. By 1514, he aligns himself with the League of Burgundy to counterbalance the growing influence of the French crown. Battles and skirmishes erupt like distant thunderstorms, none of which seem to dampen Henry's enthusiasm for foreign adventure. His armies cross the Channel, capturing minor strongholds that allow him to boast back home of England's might. Yet, war is expensive. The treasury drains faster than it can be replenished, and Parliament grumbles under the growing pressure to raise new taxes. But none dare directly oppose the young king yet. After all, to defy Henry is to risk far more than disfavor. It's to risk your very head. As the years pass and Henry's reign matures, the glow of youthful optimism begins to dim beneath the heavy weight of expectation that surrounds every monarch. The cheering crowds that once lined the streets at his coronation are still there, but their voices carry a different edge now. A mixture of admiration, fear, and uncertainty. The great halls of his expanding palaces are filled with whispers behind richly embroidered curtains, where noblemen and diplomats quietly speculate about the king's growing obsession, the matter of the royal succession. Though Eleanor remains a faithful and dutiful queen, fate has proven cruel. The royal couple's attempts to produce a robust male heir have been met with tragedy after tragedy. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and infants claimed by illness have left the cradle at court hauntingly empty. Only one child, a daughter named Margaret, survives into healthy childhood. Her presence both a source of pride and gnawing frustration for Henry. For while he dotes on little Margaret, carrying her in his arms before visiting dignitaries and parading her charm before his courtiers, she is not the solution to the kingdom's growing fear of instability. In the Grand Council chambers, the king's advisors nervously glance at one another during meetings, understanding the unspoken reality. England's recent history is haunted by the shadow of civil war. Barely 2 decades prior, the Wars of the Roses left the nation bleeding as rival families tore at each other for control of the throne. Henry's own father seized power through battle, a reminder of how fragile royal legitimacy can be without a clear and undisputed male successor. The question of who will sit on the throne after Henry looms like a dark cloud over every royal banquet, every diplomatic negotiation, and every whispered conversation in the court's dimly lit corridors. In public, Henry remains the embodiment of power and control, but privately, doubt festers. Advisors tread carefully as they present options for strengthening England's political alliances, but always the conversation circles back to the same issue: securing a future male heir. Eleanor, ever the devoted consort, does everything in her power to comfort the king, offering prayers, fasting, and making generous donations to monasteries in hopes of divine favor. Yet her age is advancing. She has now crossed into her mid-40s, and physicians mutter behind closed doors that hopes for further pregnancies are fading rapidly. Henry, increasingly tormented by this predicament, begins to interpret his misfortunes as signs of divine displeasure. The words of certain scholars and clerics echo in his mind, drawing from ancient scripture to suggest that his marriage to his late brother's widow may have invited God's wrath upon his house. One passage from the sacred texts becomes his fixation, warning that a man who takes his brother's wife shall be left childless. Though their daughter lives, Henry twists the meaning to justify his growing desperation. And into this charged atmosphere steps a woman who will change the course of English history forever. Her name is Annette de Foix, a lady-in-waiting recently returned from the French court, where she acquired not only an education in fine manners and elegant fashion, but also the subtle arts of intrigue and persuasion that dominate European courts. Unlike her sister Isabel, who previously had a fleeting affair with the king years prior, Annette refuses to be drawn into Henry's bed so easily. Her refusal only ignites the king's determination. Annette's presence at court becomes a magnetic force, pulling Henry's attention ever closer, while pushing the court into dangerous factions, those who support the queen and those who secretly hope Annette might provide the king with the son he craves. Unlike many women of her station, Annette wields her intelligence as deftly as any sword. She debates theology with visiting clerics, converses in multiple languages with foreign ambassadors, and demonstrates a keen understanding of court politics that leaves many noblemen uneasy. She knows the king's desire, but she also understands the game. She makes it clear that she will not become his mistress like so many others. She demands the crown itself. For Henry, who has always seen himself as the master of his own destiny, this challenge only strengthens his resolve. Behind the thick oak doors of the council chambers, the king's most trusted ministers are summoned to discuss the growing crisis. The Lord Chancellor, Edward Hargrave, a brilliant strategist who rose not through noble birth but through his mastery of negotiation and diplomacy, cautions Henry about the delicate balance they now face. Securing an annulment from Eleanor would not only require papal approval, but would also risk inflaming tensions with powerful foreign allies, particularly the sprawling empire controlled by Eleanor's formidable nephew, Emperor Charles VI. The Holy Roman Empire looms large over Europe, and any insult to the Queen would provoke a response that could drag England into open conflict. But Henry grows increasingly impatient with caution. He dispatches envoys to Rome, attempting to persuade Pope Clement IX to grant an annulment under the unique circumstances of his marriage. Days turn into months, months into years, as negotiations stall in a tangled web of political pressure and papal fear. The Pope, recently threatened by imperial troops who marched into the Eternal City itself, finds his hands tied. He dares not anger Emperor Charles, who holds both political and military dominance over much of the continent. Rome becomes a labyrinth of stalled decisions and polite evasions, with the king's ambassadors growing more desperate with each passing season. Meanwhile, the court back in London grows tense, as allegiances shift like sand beneath a rising tide. Some nobles see opportunity in aligning themselves with Annette, believing her ascendancy could usher in new favor and lucrative appointments. Others remain fiercely loyal to Queen Eleanor, whose dignity in the face of public humiliation has only deepened the respect she commands among many subjects. Servants whisper nervously in shadowed corridors, careful not to reveal their sympathies, for rumors of disloyalty travel swiftly and dangerously in Henry's kingdom. Annette, for her part, masterfully cultivates her growing faction. She sponsors scholars who challenge the Church's authority, funds translations of controversial texts, and surrounds herself with a circle of reform-minded courtiers eager to reshape the kingdom's religious identity. Quietly, an intellectual revolution brews beneath the surface, fanned by foreign ideas spreading from the German states where Martin Luther's defiance of Rome has sparked a wildfire across Christendom. Henry watches these developments with calculating eyes. Where once his defense of Catholic orthodoxy earned him the title Protector of the Faith from the Pope himself, now he finds new justification for challenging the authority that stands between him and his future. His frustration deepens with every papal delay. The king's patience, once lauded as one of his virtues, has eroded into bitter resolve. If the Pope will not grant him freedom, perhaps England must find its own path. Outside the towering stone walls of Westminster, commoners go about their daily struggle, unaware that the ground beneath their feet is slowly shifting. Farmers tend their fields, merchants haggle in bustling markets, children play in narrow alleys, and priests lead familiar prayers within ancient parish churches. Yet beneath this seemingly unchanging routine, the seeds of a profound transformation are already taking root, planted by the personal desires of a king who refuses to surrender to fate. And as winter descends upon the kingdom once more, the fires within Henry's chambers burn late into the night. Annette remains in his thoughts, her image as vivid as ever. The kingdom waits, tense and uncertain, as its king prepares to challenge the very foundations of European authority. The storm is coming. The year turns to 1527, and the chill winds that whip through the towering turrets of Whitehall Palace seem to carry with them the weight of Henry's growing determination. Within the private chambers of his sprawling estate, where thick velvet drapes block out the winter's icy breath and massive hearths roar with blazing fires, the king paces restlessly across the polished stone floors. Every candlelit evening brings more legal documents, more theological arguments, and more frustration as Rome continues to stall his request for annulment. Henry's once youthful exuberance has hardened into obsession, and his council of advisors grows increasingly divided between those who fear the consequences of defying the Pope and those who see opportunity in England breaking free from Rome's grasp entirely. Among those who step into the growing void of influence is a man named Gregory Whitmore, a former merchant's apprentice whose sharp intellect and ruthless pragmatism have elevated him to the king's inner circle. Gregory possesses none of the noble lineage that traditionally characterizes Henry's advisors, but his keen ability to navigate legal loopholes and orchestrate complex political maneuvers makes him invaluable at this critical juncture. Whitmore whispers a bold idea into the king's ear. What if England simply no longer recognized papal authority? What if the solution to the king's problem was not in waiting for Rome's permission, but in severing the cords that bind England to foreign rule entirely? For Henry, the idea is electrifying. The Pope, after all, has done nothing but delay and equivocate, paralyzed by the political stranglehold of Emperor Charles. The king's patience is exhausted. Every passing month feels like an affront to his authority, a humiliation that strikes at the core of his sovereignty. Gregory's plan offers not only a path forward, but also a chance to redefine monarchy itself. If Henry is to be king in the fullest sense, should he not also be supreme head of both his state and its church? The audacity of such a move thrills Henry, but he understands the gravity of what lies ahead. This is no minor dispute. It is a revolution cloaked in legal robes and theological argument. As the king considers his options, Annette remains ever present, both physically and in his imagination. Her refusal to compromise her virtue has only amplified her hold over him. She understands Henry's ambitions better than anyone, feeding his dreams with whispered promises of a son, a dynasty secured, and a legacy untouched by the weakness of compromise. Her influence grows not only in the private corridors of the palace but also in the public sphere, where her supporters carefully position themselves for the shift they believe is coming. The court becomes a chessboard of dangerous intrigue, where every move is calculated, every alliance scrutinized, and every misstep potentially fatal. Outside the gilded walls of the court, the common people begin to hear murmurs of change, though few comprehend its full scale. Sermons delivered from ancient stone pulpits carry veiled references to disputes between king and church. Pamphlets, smuggled from the continent, circulate among a small but growing number of merchants and scholars who dare to question the Pope's authority. The ideas of reformers like Luther and Zwingli find cautious supporters within England's merchant guilds, and among a handful of bold priests willing to risk accusations of heresy. For most, however, daily life continues much as it always has, dominated by the relentless rhythm of labor, prayer, and survival. Yet beneath this surface calm, the tectonic plates of England's religious identity are beginning to shift. In the summer of that year, Henry calls together a specially appointed council to discuss the legality of his marriage. He summons some of the kingdom's most learned theologians and legal minds to Westminster, charging them with the task of evaluating the biblical basis for his annulment. Though many are initially hesitant, the king's position as both sovereign and benefactor makes their allegiance clear. A carefully crafted consensus emerges, concluding that Henry's marriage to Eleanor was indeed unlawful in the eyes of God, despite papal dispensation at the time of their union. The findings provide Henry with the justification he needs to pursue an annulment independently of Rome, but he knows that formalizing such a decision will spark outrage far beyond England's shores. As the political storm brews, the personal drama intensifies. Queen Eleanor, though deeply wounded by her husband's betrayal, refuses to yield. Her dignity and composure in public mask the torment she endures behind closed doors. She writes letters to her powerful nephew, Emperor Charles, pleading for his intervention. She appeals directly to the Pope, insisting that her marriage was lawful, valid, and blessed. Every move she makes, however, seems only to entrench Henry's resolve. In his mind, her defiance becomes confirmation of the righteousness of his cause. What began as personal frustration has now transformed into a grand, ideological crusade. The year 1529 arrives like a sharp knife. Gregory Whitmore intensifies his efforts, introducing a sweeping piece of legislation in Parliament known as the Sovereignty Act. Under this act, all ecclesiastical authority within England is declared subject first and foremost to the Crown. While not yet a formal break from Rome, the act signals Henry's clear intent to redefine the relationship between church and monarchy. The move provokes outrage from Rome and emboldens reformist factions within England. The battle lines are drawn. It is during this time that another critical figure emerges on the stage. Thomas Blackstone, a brilliant legal mind educated in the Dutch universities, arrives at court under Whitmore's recommendation. Blackstone's understanding of continental legal theory, combined with his ability to weave complex theological arguments, makes him a powerful asset to the king's cause. His writings skillfully position Henry's desired annulment, not as an act of defiance, but as a necessary step to preserve the sanctity of true Christian governance, free from foreign interference. Blackstone's arguments circulate rapidly among England's educated elite, carefully shaping public opinion in favor of the king's agenda. As debates rage in Parliament and the clergy are summoned to justify their loyalty, the mood at court grows increasingly dangerous. Spies operate freely within the palace walls, reporting every whispered conversation back to their patrons. Nobles who once sat comfortably in positions of favor now glance nervously over their shoulders, aware that shifting loyalties can lead swiftly from power to the scaffold. The king himself, though surrounded by supporters, grows ever more paranoid, trusting fewer advisors with the full scope of his plans. By autumn, Eleanor is effectively exiled from court. She resides in increasingly isolated estates, where she is watched constantly by royal agents. Contact with her daughter Margaret becomes sporadic and heavily monitored. Despite her suffering, she refuses to renounce her claim as Henry's true wife, even as Annette prepares for what seems inevitable. The once beloved queen has now become an inconvenient symbol of resistance. As the first snows fall, Henry convenes a final council, this time held in the grandeur of Hampton Court. With towering ceilings adorned in intricate carvings and flickering candlelight casting elongated shadows across the chamber walls, the atmosphere is thick with anticipation. The king, flanked by Blackstone and Whitmore, declares that England's destiny must no longer be shackled by the corruptions of Rome. The council echoes his declaration. For the first time in England's history, the crown asserts spiritual supremacy within its borders. The break is not yet final, but the path has been chosen. Outside the palace, the great English countryside sleeps under a blanket of snow, its villages and towns unaware that the world they know is already crumbling beneath them. The next chapter of Henry's reign will not simply be a political dispute, it will become a revolution. The year is now 1531. The chill that lingers in the English air is not simply the bite of winter, but the tension saturating the entire realm. Every noble family, every parish, every merchant and farmer senses that something irreversible is unfolding. For centuries, the Pope in Rome has been the unchallenged authority over the spiritual life of the kingdom. But now Henry stands poised to rewrite that order entirely. What was once whispered speculation among courtiers has now become open discourse in taverns and marketplaces. The king no longer waits for Rome. The Sovereignty Act has shifted power decisively, but Henry knows this is only the first wave crashing against the ancient walls of papal authority. To complete his break, he requires not just legal maneuvering, but a bold and final strike that leaves no ambiguity. Annette, now no longer merely a lady-in-waiting but the unofficial queen-in-waiting, moves through the court with deliberate grace. Her every step, every word is calculated, knowing that any misstep might still derail her rise. Behind her elegant smiles lies a calculating mind, one that has masterfully guided Henry's obsession toward this unprecedented clash with the Church. She surrounds herself with thinkers and reformers, many of whom have been influenced by the rapidly spreading ideas born from German reformers across the continent. They whisper to her, offer pamphlets and treatises, feed her mind with arguments Henry can wield as weapons in his battle for autonomy. Henry, emboldened by Annette's influence and Whitmore's political scaffolding, begins to escalate his confrontation. He orders a series of inquiries into the practices of the English clergy, demanding full financial and political accountability. Dozens of bishops and abbots are summoned before royal commissions to answer questions about their loyalty. Accusations of mismanagement, moral corruption, and foreign allegiance swirl like a storm within ecclesiastical halls. Though many of these charges are exaggerated, some clergy confess to avoid harsher consequences, while others are imprisoned for defiance. The message is clear: the king's authority now supersedes all others. By spring, the final blow to the queen arrives. Eleanor is officially stripped of her title and relocated to a secluded estate in the damp northern countryside, far from the splendor of London. Her staff is reduced, her correspondence heavily censored. Margaret, now entering her teenage years, is forcibly separated from her mother, kept at court under the watchful eyes of officials loyal to Annette's faction. Despite her isolation, Eleanor continues to maintain her dignity, refusing to acknowledge the annulment or surrender her title as the rightful Queen of England. Meanwhile, Henry's advisors continue to consolidate the theological foundation for the king's supremacy. Thomas Blackstone works tirelessly, composing treatises that are distributed widely among the clergy and nobility. He frames Henry's leadership not as rebellion, but as a return to ancient English sovereignty, a kingdom where no foreign ruler holds dominion over the king's soul or his people's salvation. The propaganda machine operates in full force, and across England's towns and villages, priests cautiously begin introducing new sermons that subtly challenge papal primacy. But Rome does not remain silent. Enraged by Henry's audacity, Pope Clement IX issues a formal warning, demanding immediate compliance and threatening excommunication should the king proceed further. Yet the Pope's threats carry less weight than they once did. England is increasingly insulated, supported by a growing class of landowners, merchants, and minor nobles who see opportunity in breaking from Rome's financial grip. Many recognize that for decades vast sums of wealth have flowed from England to the Vatican under the guise of indulgences, tithes, and taxes. Now, with the king poised to sever that flow, these emerging power brokers envision riches and influence redistributed within England's borders. In the summer of 1532, Henry makes a bold political move to cement his control. He demands the resignation of key church leaders who oppose him, replacing them with men loyal to his vision. Among the most significant appointments is Edward Langford, a former academic and deeply pragmatic theologian who was elevated to the newly restructured position of Archbishop of Canterbury. Langford, while not a radical reformer, shares Henry's belief that England must chart its own spiritual course free from papal interference. His appointment signals to the world that the king's religious revolution is now fully institutionalized. With Langford's elevation, the stage is set for Henry's next decisive act. As the court prepares for a season of extravagant feasts and hunting tournaments, the king secretly weds Annette in a private ceremony, attended only by a few trusted confidants. The timing is not arbitrary. Annette, now visibly pregnant, carries the potential heir Henry has so desperately pursued for over a decade. By marrying her before the child's birth, Henry ensures the child's legitimacy under English law, even as Rome still recognizes Eleanor as his lawful wife. News of the secret marriage spreads rapidly through the court and into the countryside, sending shockwaves across the realm. For the common people, the implications are both confusing and frightening. Their entire lives have been governed by the doctrines of the Catholic Church, its sacraments, its festivals, its saints. The sudden upheaval of these traditions leaves many bewildered, unsure of how to reconcile their obedience to the king with their lifelong faith. Some local priests attempt to reassure their congregations, preaching loyalty to the crown while carefully avoiding direct criticism of Rome. Others refuse to comply, resulting in their removal or imprisonment. Even as Henry's marriage to Annette becomes public knowledge, Eleanor remains steadfast in her resistance. Letters smuggled from her isolated estate reveal her continued appeals to Emperor Charles, imploring him to pressure the Pope to excommunicate Henry and declare his new union invalid. Across the continent, monarchs and church leaders watch the unfolding crisis with a mixture of fascination and horror, recognizing that the stakes extend far beyond England's shores. If Henry succeeds, he may set a precedent for other rulers dissatisfied with Rome's authority. The year 1533 dawns, marking what will become the most transformative period of Henry's reign. Parliament, under immense pressure from the king's loyalists, passes the Act of Appeals, formally severing England's legal subordination to the papal courts. The act declares that all matters of marriage and religious dispute within England are to be settled solely by English authorities, rendering Rome powerless to intervene in Henry's affairs. Within weeks, Archbishop Langford convenes a special ecclesiastical court, which delivers the king his long-sought verdict. His marriage to Eleanor is declared null and void, his marriage to Annette lawful and blessed. In June, a lavish coronation ceremony elevates Annette to her rightful position as Queen of England. Dressed in flowing crimson silk, her hair crowned with a magnificent tiara of rubies and sapphires, she processes through London's crowded streets under a canopy of gold. Yet, amidst the ceremony's pageantry, the mood among the gathered citizens is conflicted. Many still love Eleanor and view Annette with suspicion, fearing the changes her influence may bring. Others cheer enthusiastically, eager to witness the birth of a new era that promises English independence from foreign rule. As Henry and Annette ascend the throne together, the kingdom stands on the brink of unprecedented transformation. What began as a personal crisis has become a seismic shift in England's religious and political landscape. The break with Rome is no longer theoretical, it is now reality. But even as Henry basks in his newfound authority, dark clouds gather on the horizon, for not all his subjects accept these changes willingly. The next chapter of Henry's reign will be written in rebellion, blood, and betrayal. The year 1534 arrives, and with it, the storm that had long been brewing across the English countryside finally begins to break. Though Henry now stands as supreme head of both state and church, his audacious transformation of England's spiritual identity has not come without consequence. In the quiet villages scattered across Yorkshire, Lancashire, and Northumberland, the old rhythms of life are under threat. For generations, the Catholic Church had not merely governed their worship, but had provided the very foundation upon which their communities rested. The monasteries dotted throughout these regions offered not only sacraments and confession, but education, charity, healthcare, and work. They were sanctuaries in times of famine and anchors in moments of joy. To many in these northern lands, Henry's reforms feel less like liberation and more like sacrilege. At the heart of the king's religious restructuring lies the new legal order enforced by Parliament, the Act of Supremacy. This monumental piece of legislation declares without reservation that Henry is now the only supreme head of the Church of England, fully severing ties with Rome. For the first time, the Pope holds no authority over English souls, while reform-minded nobles, merchants, and bureaucrats celebrate the assertion of national sovereignty. The common folk are left disoriented, unsure how to navigate this abrupt rupture from traditions that had governed their every holiday, prayer, and festival since birth. Annette, now visibly pregnant with the child Henry believes will secure his legacy, presides over a court transformed into a nucleus of reformist fervor. The royal chapels begin to strip away images of saints, relics are removed, and newly commissioned prayer books reflect a doctrine increasingly distant from Rome. Monasteries, once bustling with the chanting of monks, are now visited by royal commissioners tasked with cataloging their wealth, assessing their moral fitness, and preparing them for dissolution. Gregory Whitmore, now the king's most powerful administrator, leads these efforts with surgical precision, dispatching waves of inspectors across the kingdom. Their reports often highlight moral decay, whether real or fabricated, to justify the impending closures. Tales of monks indulging in secret vices, abbots living in decadent luxury, and nuns violating their vows circulate widely, feeding public narratives of corruption that cloak the monarchy's true objective, seizing vast monastic wealth to fund Henry's insatiable appetite for construction, war, and courtly extravagance. Yet not all Englishmen are convinced by these justifications. In the north, where Catholic devotion remains strongest, resistance simmers beneath the surface. Among the landed gentry, clergy, and common farmers alike, whispered meetings take place in candlelit barns and hidden glades. What begins as scattered grumbling soon crystallizes into a powerful grassroots movement determined to reverse Henry's reforms. They call themselves the Pilgrims of Grace. Cloaked under the banner of religious devotion, these rebels seek not only to restore papal authority, but to protect their way of life from annihilation. By the autumn of 1536, the first great wave of rebellion erupts. Thousands of men, armed with farm tools, crude weapons, and makeshift banners embroidered with the 5 wounds of Christ, march southward. Their leaders, landowners, abbots, and former knights, issue formal demands calling for the restoration of the monasteries, the removal of corrupt royal advisors, and the return of England to the Pope's fold. At their head stands Sir Richard Malvern, a charismatic noble with deep ties to northern Catholic families. His leadership galvanizes the rebellion into a disciplined and deeply motivated force. News of the uprising reaches Henry as he holds court at Windsor. The king, though enraged, understands the magnitude of the threat before him. This is not a ragtag mob easily dispersed, but a disciplined and well-organized army drawing strength from regional loyalty and religious conviction. To confront the rebellion directly risks sparking further uprisings across the kingdom. Instead, Henry employs the art of deceitful diplomacy. He dispatches envoys north, offering pardons, promising to hear grievances, and even entertaining the possibility of reversing certain reforms, all empty words designed to buy time. Annette watches with keen interest as her husband navigates the crisis. She understands, perhaps more than most at court, that rebellion threatens not only Henry's rule but her own precarious position. The birth of her child approaches, and with every day the rebellion grows. So too does the danger that her unborn heir may be born into a kingdom teetering on civil war. As winter settles upon the land, negotiations between the crown's envoys and the rebel leaders result in a fragile ceasefire. Malvern, believing Henry's promises to be genuine, agrees to disband his forces and return home, confident that reforms will be reconsidered. But the moment the rebels lay down their arms, Henry's true nature reveals itself once more. The promises of mercy evaporate. Arrests sweep across the north like a bitter wind. Malvern and dozens of his commanders are seized, dragged before royal tribunals, and condemned to death for treason. The punishments are brutal and public. Executions are staged across multiple towns, the condemned paraded before their neighbors, their bodies subjected to the full horror of drawing and quartering. The message is unmistakable. No rebellion, no matter how righteous it may claim to be, will challenge Henry's authority without consequence. Back in London, Henry receives news of his crushing victory with satisfaction, but also with a steely recognition that the rebellion was a symptom of deeper unrest that may one day rise again. Even as his power appears unchallenged, the scars of the Pilgrimage of Grace will haunt his reign, a reminder that beneath the surface of his reformation lies a kingdom divided. By early 1537, Annette gives birth at Hampton Court Palace. The child is a daughter, blessed with vibrant auburn hair and piercing green eyes, a beautiful infant whom Henry names Elizabeth. Though privately disappointed that his long-awaited male heir has once again eluded him, Henry declares his joy before the court. Lavish celebrations ensue, with banquets that stretch for days and endless performances commissioned to honor the infant princess's arrival. But behind closed doors, Henry's frustrations mount. The stability of his dynasty remains fragile without a son to secure the Tudor line. Annette's position, once seemingly unshakable, now begins to erode subtly as court factions shift once more. Her enemies, many of whom remained silent during the height of her influence, now find renewed courage to whisper in the king's ear. They question her conduct, her political interference, and her inability to bear a son. Even Gregory Whitmore, her staunchest ally, recognizes the dangerous currents swirling beneath the surface and begins to cautiously distance himself from the queen he once helped raise to power. By 1538, Henry's court has become a pressure cooker of ambition, suspicion, and silent rivalry. The dissolutions of the monasteries continue with renewed ferocity. Hundreds of religious houses are stripped of their gold, their libraries burned or sold, their lands divided among the king's most loyal nobles. The wealth pouring into the royal treasury is staggering, yet Henry's appetite for splendor and military preparedness consumes it almost as quickly as it arrives. Vast sums are spent on elaborate palace renovations, towering fortifications, and displays of royal magnificence designed to awe foreign dignitaries and visiting merchants. The very landscape of England begins to change as former monasteries are converted into private estates for newly empowered nobles, while countless displaced monks, nuns, and servants scatter into uncertain futures. In towns once anchored by the stability of monastic charity, poverty and vagrancy rise, fueling social tensions that threaten to boil over once again. And through it all, Henry stands at the center of the maelstrom, his authority uncontested, yet his kingdom increasingly unstable. Even as England transforms before his eyes, Henry knows his most dangerous battles still lie ahead, for power, once seized, must be guarded fiercely, and his enemies, both seen and unseen, have only begun to sharpen their blades. The year 1539 dawns upon a kingdom transformed but deeply unsettled. Henry sits upon a throne that seems, at a glance, stronger than ever. His coffers overflow with the spoils of dissolved monasteries. His authority as supreme head of the Church of England is absolute, and his word is now law not only in matters of state, but also in the hearts and souls of his people. Yet beneath this gilded surface, the very foundation of his court trembles with unseen fractures. Whispers drift through the corridors of Whitehall and Hampton Court like cold drafts under heavy wooden doors. Whispers about Queen Annette. What had once been admiration for her intellect, grace, and strength has now curdled into quiet resentment and dangerous intrigue. Her failure to bear a son hangs like a dark cloud over her once brilliant ascent, providing ammunition for her rivals who lurk in the shadows, waiting patiently for their moment. Among those circling like wolves is Lady Margaret Somerset, a noblewoman of Old English blood whose family remained loyal to the conservative factions of the old church. She views Annette not only as a foreign influence but as a symbol of unwanted change, a usurper who led the king into open war against tradition, Rome, and God himself. Somerset's influence at court grows subtly but steadily, aligning herself with a group of discontented nobles and former clergy who dream of restoring the old order. Quiet meetings in private chambers become strategy sessions, where every gesture of the queen is dissected, twisted, and catalogued into accusations that can be used against her when the time is right. Henry, too, begins to shift beneath the weight of unfulfilled hopes. The once consuming passion that drove him to risk everything for Annette's hand has soured into quiet dissatisfaction. He grows increasingly irritable, withdrawing his attention from her and focusing instead on matters of state, international alliances, and military defense. Across the Channel, Europe remains a nest of vipers. Emperor Charles still seethes over Henry's break from Rome, and though outright war has not erupted, threats from the continent remain ever present. The king's counselors advise him that England cannot stand alone forever and must seek new alliances to secure its position. At court, a new face emerges, one that carries with it the promise of stability and submission that Henry now craves. Her name is Jane Hargrave, a demure noblewoman from a long-established English family loyal to the crown. Where Annette had been bold, outspoken, and intellectually formidable, Jane is the very embodiment of quiet obedience and humility. She speaks softly, listens attentively, and presents herself as the perfect antidote to the increasingly tense atmosphere surrounding Annette. Henry finds comfort in Jane's simplicity, her gentle manner offering a balm to his frayed nerves. As Jane's star rises, Annette finds herself increasingly isolated. Former allies distance themselves, wary of falling from favor. Even Gregory Whitmore, once her fiercest advocate, now walks a cautious line, unwilling to risk his hard-won position within the king's inner circle. Meanwhile, Lady Somerset and her faction work tirelessly behind the scenes, constructing a web of accusations that will soon ensnare the queen. The accusations begin innocuously enough. Questions about Annette's involvement in state matters, rumors that she has overstepped her role by influencing court appointments, whispers that she has encouraged sympathies toward radical reformers who border on heresy. But as the rumors spread, they evolve into far darker charges: adultery, treason, and even conspiracy against the king's life. Somerset ensures that carefully coached witnesses are ready, men and women who, whether through genuine loyalty, ambition, or fear, are prepared to swear to the queen's guilt. By early 1540, the trap is sprung. Annette is arrested under the weight of an avalanche of accusations so damning that even those who know the truth dare not speak in her defense. She is escorted to the Tower of London, not as the queen who once walked triumphantly through its gates on the eve of her coronation, but as a prisoner awaiting judgment. The cold stone walls of the tower offer no comfort now, their damp breath whispering of countless others who met their doom within these ancient halls. Henry watches from afar as the proceedings unfold, his heart hardened by betrayal both real and imagined. Whether he truly believes the charges matters little. The queen's failure to produce a male heir has made her expendable, and her removal paves the way for a future unburdened by past mistakes. The trial, though public, is a mere formality. The outcome has been decided long before the first witness takes the stand. Annette, dignified even in the face of death, denies all accusations but offers no resistance to her fate. Her once fierce voice, which had captivated a king and reshaped a nation, speaks only in calm resignation. On a gray morning in May, Annette is led to Tower Green, where the scaffold stands draped in black cloth. The executioner, imported from abroad for his skill, awaits her arrival. Dressed in a simple gray gown, her dark hair tucked beneath a modest cap, Annette ascends the steps with measured grace. She kneels upon the cold wooden block, offering a brief prayer before addressing the gathered witnesses. In her final words, she declares her innocence, but prays for the king's well-being and the kingdom's prosperity, her voice steady, even as the axe is raised. With a single stroke, Annette's life ends, and with it, one of the most dramatic chapters of Henry's reign. The queen's body is quietly buried within the chapel on the Tower grounds, unmarked and unadorned, her name soon erased from courtly conversation. Within days, Henry marries Jane Hargrave, wasting no time in securing the next attempt at producing the long-desired male heir. Jane's motto, "Bound to obey and serve," becomes the perfect reflection of what Henry now seeks in his queen, a figurehead who offers comfort, loyalty, and above all, obedience. While the court celebrates its new queen, the kingdom beyond the palace walls continues to reel from the aftershocks of Annette's fall. The destruction of the monasteries accelerates as Henry, guided by Whitmore, oversees the systematic dismantling of the final religious houses. Their lands are seized, their treasures stripped, and their communities scattered. Monks and nuns, once sheltered within their sacred walls, now roam the countryside, many reduced to poverty or absorbed into secular life as teachers, healers, or humble laborers. The cultural loss is immeasurable. Libraries that once held centuries of accumulated knowledge are burned or sold for scrap. Priceless manuscripts are discarded as trash, their pages used to wrap goods or polish boots. Magnificent stone abbeys, Architectural marvels that had stood for generations are reduced to ruins or repurposed as private estates for the king's loyal nobles. The countryside, once dotted with sacred houses, now bears scars where the church's influence once stood unchallenged. Yet despite the wealth pouring into Henry's coffers from these seizures, the king's extravagant lifestyle ensures that much of it vanishes as quickly as it arrives. Lavish banquets, opulent clothing, and elaborate building projects devour funds with astonishing speed. Wars on the continent, defensive fortifications along the coast, and costly diplomatic missions drain the treasury further still. What should have secured generations of royal prosperity instead feeds an endless cycle of consumption, leaving England perpetually perched upon the edge of financial instability. And as the royal court gathers once again in grand halls illuminated by flickering candlelight, few dare to speak aloud what many privately fear: that even with Annette gone and Jane now installed at his side, the king's hunger for power, for control, and for a son remains insatiable. The year 1541 settles over England like a heavy, brooding fog, thick with the aftertaste of blood, betrayal, and unrelenting ambition. The kingdom stands visibly altered by the upheavals of recent years. The great monasteries, once symbols of piety and stability, are gutted monuments now claimed by ambitious nobles or left as haunting skeletons on the hillsides. The familiar rhythms of daily life, once guided by the bells of monasteries and the calendar of saints, are increasingly dictated by the ever-tightening grip of the royal court. Yet for Henry, despite the wreckage that trails behind him, the dream of securing his legacy remains as sharp and alive as ever. His new queen, Jane Hargrave, walks the corridors of court with a measured, docile grace, always a few steps behind her king, her eyes lowered in deference. She has quickly become the model of submission Henry had long sought. And though her political influence is negligible, her quiet presence soothes the volatile monarch in a way no one else has succeeded. By the following spring, Jane presents Henry with the news that once again fills the court with hope. She is with child. The announcement triggers an eruption of celebration across the palace grounds. The court, desperate to please the king, arranges elaborate tournaments, feasts, and prayers to bless the pregnancy. Henry allows himself to believe, perhaps for the first time since his reign began, that divine favor has finally turned in his direction. The whispers of his courtiers reflect a cautious optimism. If Jane delivers a healthy son, it will secure the Tudor legacy that so many years of turmoil and sacrifice have aimed to protect. As the months pass, Henry grows increasingly involved in the affairs of his expanding private estates, many of which are former monastic properties now redistributed to his loyal supporters. These nobles, elevated from modest origins into positions of immense power, owe their entire fortunes to Henry's dissolution of the monasteries. In turn, their loyalty forms the foundation of his increasingly centralized authority. Among these men stands Gregory Whitmore, who now controls vast tracts of land and wealth. Yet even he, having risen through the ranks by mastering court intrigue, senses that the same system that brought him power could one day devour him should the king's favor ever waver. Despite these political victories, England's relationship with the rest of Europe remains fraught with danger. Emperor Charles, still bristling over Henry's defiance of Rome and his treatment of Queen Eleanor, continues to maneuver his alliances carefully, while France remains both a rival and a potential threat. Henry's diplomats work tirelessly to broker agreements and secure trade routes, but the king, never one to fully trust the slippery promises of foreign rulers, begins preparations for the possibility of war. New fortifications rise along the southern coast. Vast sums are allocated to armories and shipyards, and England's defensive readiness consumes much of the wealth that once seemed endless. Within the court itself, new tensions quietly simmer beneath the surface. The radical religious reforms that Henry had unleashed are not easily contained. As monasteries disappeared and papal authority was broken, a growing faction of radical reformers has pushed further, demanding even more dramatic changes to English religious practice. They argue for stripping churches of all ornamentation, abandoning many ancient rites and translating the entire liturgy into English. For them, Henry's reforms have not gone far enough. Conversely, a conservative bloc within the nobility, still secretly loyal to many Catholic traditions, warns that these reforms threaten to destabilize the kingdom entirely. Henry finds himself walking an increasingly narrow path, balancing competing forces that threaten to pull his reign apart from both ends. As autumn arrives, Jane delivers the child the entire kingdom has prayed for, a boy whom Henry names Edward. The court explodes with jubilation. At last, a legitimate male heir stands ready to carry the Tudor legacy forward. Henry orders days of public celebration across London, with parades, masses, and tournaments staged in honor of the newborn prince. Bells ring across the countryside as citizens gather in the streets, both out of genuine celebration and fearful obligation. For the first time in decades, the question of succession no longer looms like a specter over the realm. But even as the people cheer and the banners wave, tragedy strikes swiftly and without mercy. Within 2 weeks of Edward's birth, Jane succumbs to postnatal complications, her health deteriorating rapidly despite the best efforts of the royal physicians. Her death plunges Henry into a deep and consuming grief unlike any he has known before. For days he secludes himself within the thick stone walls of his private chambers, refusing audiences and shunning the company of his advisors. The queen who had finally delivered his long-sought son is gone, and with her passing, the fragile peace that had settled over Henry's court begins to fracture once more. In the months following Jane's death, Henry emerges from mourning altered. His once athletic frame, already softening with age, swells further. The king's notorious appetite grows unchecked, and his health begins to deteriorate more visibly. A persistent ulcer on his leg plagues him constantly, making even short walks a painful ordeal. His legendary temper, once sharp but controlled, becomes increasingly volatile. Courtiers who had previously maneuvered easily through the political landscape now proceed with extreme caution, aware that a single misstep could end in exile or execution. Amidst this personal turmoil, Gregory Whitmore seizes the opportunity to strengthen his position further. He orchestrates lucrative trade deals, arranges advantageous marriages for his relatives, and continues overseeing the redistribution of monastic lands. His influence rivals that of any nobleman at court, but his success earns him new enemies as well, men who view his rise as unnatural and dangerous. The court, now more than ever, becomes a treacherous maze of ambition and betrayal, where alliances shift as rapidly as the king's moods. Henry's council, recognizing both his grief and his need for continued dynastic stability, urges him to consider another marriage. European politics once again become entangled in the king's personal affairs. Envoys from across the continent present portraits of eligible princesses, each one accompanied by promises of trade alliances, military support, and political stability. Among these candidates is Christina of Holstein, a young noblewoman known for both her striking beauty and her sharp political acumen. But Henry, perhaps for the first time, hesitates. His experience with marriage has left him wary, his trust eroded by years of personal and political disappointment. Nevertheless, the demands of the crown override personal reluctance. After months of negotiation, Henry agrees to marry Christina, hoping her union will solidify England's fragile relationships with several northern European powers. The marriage, while not marked by the same passion that once ignited his relationship with Annette, offers a necessary alliance that temporarily steadies England's diplomatic footing. Christina's arrival at court is met with cautious optimism. She carries herself with regal composure, her demeanor calm and deliberate. Unlike Henry's previous queens, she involves herself sparingly in political matters, focusing instead on managing the royal household and ensuring Edward's upbringing proceeds under strict supervision. The court breathes a brief sigh of relief as stability seems to return, but few are naive enough to believe that peace can endure for long in Henry's England. Even as foreign alliances strengthen, domestic unrest continues to simmer beneath the surface. Displaced monks, impoverished commoners, and disillusioned priests whisper in hushed gatherings about the loss of the old ways. Smuggled writings from the continent fuel the fires of dissent, spreading both Protestant and Catholic resistance across the land. Henry's brutal suppression of opposition has kept rebellion at bay for now, but the fires have not been extinguished. They merely await new fuel. As winter descends, Henry surveys his kingdom with the weariness of a man who has sacrificed everything for control. His legacy seems secure, his son healthy, and his enemies scattered, yet his victories are stained by the immense cost at which they came. The king's reign has reshaped England into something unrecognizable from the world he inherited, but his hunger for power remains undiminished, and in the darkened halls of the royal court, where ambition festers like mold in damp stone, new conspiracies are already taking root, ready to test the strength of a crown built on blood, fire, and broken faith. The year 1543 stretches over England like a taut rope, quivering beneath the weight of tensions both foreign and domestic. Henry, now visibly aging and burdened by years of political warfare and personal loss, rules from behind heavily guarded chambers while the machinery of his government grinds on under the watchful eyes of his advisors. His once towering frame has become swollen and heavy, his once tireless energy replaced by painful stiffness that demands he be carried through his palaces in specially constructed chairs. The ulcer on his leg, constantly oozing and rank, is a source of both physical agony and foul mood, further inflaming the king's already dangerous temper. Courtiers lower their gazes and tread with delicate precision, knowing that even the smallest miscalculation could trigger a storm of royal wrath that often ends not just in disgrace, but in death. Beyond the palace walls, the kingdom remains restless. Although Henry has succeeded in suppressing large-scale uprisings like the Pilgrimage of Grace, discontent still pulses through every corner of his realm. The dissolution of the monasteries has permanently reshaped the countryside, replacing centuries-old centers of learning, charity, and faith with sprawling estates for the newly wealthy nobility. Many of these nobles, enriched by their king's confiscations, now wield considerable influence, their loyalty tied directly to the fortunes they have acquired at the expense of the old church. But even among them, unease grows. Some fear that Henry's heavy hand may one day turn upon them, as it has turned upon so many others. Meanwhile, displaced monks, former abbots, and common folk displaced by the destruction of monastic life find no solace in the king's vision of reform. The safety nets that once sustained them have vanished, replaced by poverty, lawlessness, and growing resentment. Secret gatherings, often led by surviving Catholic priests, convene in hidden chapels and forest clearings, keeping alive the forbidden rites of the old faith. The countryside becomes a patchwork of silent rebellion, where the king's agents hunt for heretics and traitors, while pockets of resistance spread quietly under cover of darkness. In the heart of court politics, Gregory Whitmore, whose loyalty and cunning have long kept him in the king's favor, grows increasingly aware of the dangerous instability beneath the court's polished surface. His position remains one of power, but it is a power constantly under threat. Rival factions seek every opportunity to undermine him, whispering in darkened corridors, planting seeds of suspicion in the ears of the king, and maneuvering for any advantage that might bring his downfall. Whitmore, now wealthier than most dukes, knows that his rise has made him a target. Every decision he makes is calculated with precision, every conversation carefully weighed for its political consequences. At the center of Whitmore's concerns is the growing presence of a conservative faction, led by Lord Thomas Percival, a nobleman of ancient lineage and unshakable loyalty to the old faith. Percival has maintained a careful distance from open rebellion, but his sympathies are no secret. Under the guise of concern for England's unity, he cultivates relationships with powerful families who resent the king's religious policies, hoping that one day a shift in fortune might allow them to restore Catholic dominance. Percival is patient, playing the long game, knowing that as Henry weakens physically, the time may come when power once again lies within his reach. Amidst these political tensions, foreign affairs continue to press upon Henry's court. Relations with the Holy Roman Empire remain icy, while France's ambitions threaten to encroach upon English interests across the Channel. Despite his alliances through marriage, Henry trusts none of his European counterparts fully. Every embassy is greeted with suspicion, every treaty viewed as temporary. The king directs enormous resources toward fortifying England's defenses, constructing massive coastal fortresses that line the southern shores like jagged teeth prepared to bite into any invading fleet. The channel bristles with newly outfitted warships, their gun decks primed to unleash devastation should foreign armies dare approach. At the same time, Henry's relationship with Queen Christina becomes increasingly strained. Although their marriage provided temporary diplomatic benefits, their personal connection never deepened. Christina, pragmatic and astute, keeps her distance from the king's inner political circles, choosing instead to focus on the upbringing of young Edward and maintaining careful neutrality in court affairs. Her cautious approach shields her from the palace's most venomous intrigues, but isolates her from true influence. Henry, frustrated by her emotional distance and consumed by the aches of age and paranoia, withdraws further into his increasingly insular council of trusted men. And yet, even as his physical body decays, Henry's mind remains sharp enough to recognize the fragility of his empire. He commands a series of sweeping reforms to tighten his control over the remaining church structure, issuing new mandates that redefine acceptable religious practices. The Book of Common Devotion is distributed across every parish, dictating the exact forms of prayer, ritual, and doctrine that the Church of England shall follow under the king's ultimate authority. While this satisfies neither the most radical reformers nor the secret Catholics, it serves to reinforce Henry's central message. All power flows from the crown, both in this life and the next. In the spring of 1544, Henry embarks on what may be his final military campaign, a show of strength aimed at intimidating France into submission. Though no longer fit for direct combat, the king travels with his army across the Channel, presiding over the siege of Boulogne. The campaign achieves limited military success but serves Henry's true purpose, projecting his power across Europe once more, reminding his rivals that even in his decline, he remains a force to be reckoned with. The cost, however, is staggering. The treasury groans under the weight of military expenditures, and the burden of taxation continues to fall heavily upon his subjects. Upon his return to England, Henry finds his court further polarized. Whitmore remains at the height of his power, but senses the shifting winds as Perceval and his conservative faction grow bolder. Rumors circulate that secret communications are being exchanged between Catholic loyalists in England and sympathetic powers abroad. The possibility of future rebellion lingers just beneath the surface, like a dormant flame awaiting only the slightest spark to ignite a new wave of bloodshed. In private, Henry confronts his own mortality more directly. He arranges for new succession documents naming Edward as his heir, while carefully outlining the roles of his remaining daughters, Margaret and Elizabeth, should Edward fail to produce heirs of his own. The king understands that the survival of his dynasty depends not only on his son's survival, but on maintaining the delicate balance of power between warring factions long after his own death. In moments of solitude, Henry broods upon the ghosts of his past, Eleanor, Annette, Jane, all women whose lives became stepping stones on his path to absolute control. The faces of those executed in the name of loyalty, faith, or rebellion haunt his private thoughts. Yet he offers himself no regrets. In his mind, every decision, no matter how brutal, was necessary to preserve the kingdom he molded with his own hand. And as another winter descends upon the realm, Henry's court continues its intricate dance of deception, ambition, and survival. The fires in the palace hearths burn brightly against the chill, but beneath the warmth every noble, every advisor, and every servant understands the reality they inhabit. Power is transient, favor is fickle, and in the shadow of the throne, no one is ever truly safe. The year 1546 unfolds under an ominous sky as Henry's reign enters its final and most fragile phase. The king, now 55 years old, sits as a bloated and broken figure atop the very empire he fought so ruthlessly to create. His massive frame, carried only by heavily reinforced chairs or supported by attendants, barely resembles the young athletic monarch who once dazzled courtiers with jousts and intellectual debates. The ulcer on his leg festers endlessly, releasing a stench that follows him through the marble corridors of his sprawling palaces. The pain leaves him irritable, quick to fury, and dangerously unpredictable. His beard, once meticulously groomed, has grown unruly, and his eyes, though still fierce, betray the exhaustion of a man who has sacrificed everything to hold his throne. Despite his failing body, Henry remains mentally alert, his mind as sharp and calculating as ever. The court, however, has grown darker, more dangerous, and increasingly paranoid. Alliances forged over decades have fractured and reformed countless times. The constant churn of favor and ruin leaves few who dare speak truthfully to the king. Even Gregory Whitmore, long the master architect behind much of Henry's reforms, treads with careful precision. His power is vast, but so too is the envy it inspires. The conservative faction, led by Lord Percival, has grown increasingly bold, whispering to those sympathetic to the old faith that the time for restoration may soon arrive. Henry, aware of the growing plots encircling his throne, embarks upon a final sweeping purge to secure his legacy before death claims him. Trusted informants are dispatched throughout the kingdom, gathering evidence both real and fabricated against anyone suspected of disloyalty. Trials are convened in hurried secrecy. Charges of heresy, treason, and conspiracy fill the dockets. Men who once dined comfortably at Henry's table find themselves dragged to the Tower, stripped of titles, wealth, and often their lives. The axe falls mercilessly, and the gallows groan beneath the weight of condemned men. Fear once again becomes the crown's sharpest weapon. Even within Henry's inner circle, no one is spared from suspicion. When whispers emerge accusing Gregory Whitmore himself of harboring sympathies with radical reformers, pushing too far beyond the king's carefully crafted religious settlement, Henry responds not with immediate condemnation, but with cold calculation. He summons Whitmore for private counsel. The once confident administrator, now aged and fully aware of the peril, kneels before his king with measured humility. Their conversation is short and chilling. Henry makes it clear that any hint of betrayal will be met with the full fury of royal justice. Whitmore, understanding the precariousness of his position, offers public denouncements of the reformers he once protected, sacrificing pawns within his network to preserve his own survival. The religious policies that once seemed so revolutionary are now tightly controlled by Henry's own moderation. He tolerates neither the extremes of radical reformers who seek to dismantle every vestige of Catholic tradition, nor the staunch conservatives who quietly long for Rome's return. The king declares himself the final arbiter of doctrine, enforcing a rigid orthodoxy that satisfies few but is challenged by none. The Book of Common Devotion remains the state's guiding religious text, and strict penalties await those who deviate from its teachings. As the king's physical health deteriorates further, his thoughts turn obsessively toward his legacy. His young son Edward, now approaching 8 years old, is bright and precocious, yet fragile in health. The child's survival remains a constant source of anxiety. Margaret and Elizabeth, his daughters by Eleanor and Annette, remain on the periphery, educated and carefully managed, but never far from political speculation. Henry arranges detailed succession plans, determined to secure a stable regency council to govern in Edward's name should his own end come prematurely. Queen Christina, still distant from court politics, focuses her efforts on Edward's education and spiritual instruction, understanding that the stability of England rests upon the small shoulders of her stepson. She employs tutors who balance the delicate line between the king's authorized doctrine and the shifting religious climate spreading across Europe. The Queen's calculated neutrality protects her from the venomous intrigues that continue to poison the air of the royal court. In the broader realm, England's common people continue to live under the heavy burden of taxes, laws, and an ever-watchful state. The destruction of the monasteries has not only altered the spiritual landscape, but has widened the gap between the wealthy and the destitute. Vagabondage increases, and local justices struggle to contain growing bands of displaced peasants who roam the countryside in search of food, shelter, and work. The old security of monastic charity is gone, replaced by royal decrees and harsh punishments for those who fail to find their place within the king's new order. Meanwhile, Europe watches Henry's twilight reign with both caution and curiosity. The Holy Roman Emperor, now more preoccupied with growing conflicts in the German states, turns his attention away from England. France, though still a rival, maintains a tense but stable peace after years of costly skirmishes. The Vatican, weakened by internal reforms and external challenges, lacks the power it once wielded when Henry first dared to break away. The international community recognizes England now as a kingdom uniquely independent, ruled by a man who has outlasted popes, emperors, and kings alike. By late 1546, Henry's body can no longer sustain his will. His once commanding voice grows thin, and his presence at council meetings diminishes. From his private chambers, he issues directives through trusted scribes while physicians work desperately to alleviate his unrelenting pain. His appetite remains gluttonous even as his body struggles to process the vast amounts of food and wine that once symbolized his grand feasts. Every day becomes a battle against his own decaying flesh. The court grows increasingly silent in his presence, the normal chatter of courtiers replaced by whispered consultations and nervous glances. The elaborate rituals of court life continue, the hunts, the tournaments, the feasts, but they are hollow performances, shadows of the vibrant spectacles that once defined his reign. Everyone senses that the sun of Henry's rule is setting, though none dare speak it aloud. In January 1547, as bitter winds rattle the stained glass windows of Whitehall Palace, the king finally succumbs. His death comes not with ceremony, but with a quiet, labored breath as his closest attendants kneel at his side. The great Tudor monarch, who reshaped the very soul of England through force of will and ruthless ambition, leaves behind a kingdom forever altered, a nation severed from Rome, governed by its sovereign's law, and defined by a new religious identity forged through blood, betrayal, and iron. Even in death, Henry controls the final image of his legacy. His elaborate funeral, planned meticulously by his own hand years in advance, unfolds with all the majesty he once demanded. His coffin, carried by dozens of nobles, makes its way to Windsor, where he is laid to rest beside Jane Hargrave, the queen who finally delivered his son. The streets are lined with subjects who bow their heads in a mixture of reverence, fear, and exhausted relief. The tyrant is dead. The kingdom holds its breath. As young Edward ascends the throne under the careful guidance of the Regency Council, England enters yet another chapter of its turbulent journey. The shadows of Henry's reign linger in every chapel, every law, and every heart that remembers the price of his ambition. His story is one of both magnificent triumph and devastating cost, a legacy carved into the very bones of the kingdom he ruled with absolute authority. With the death of Henry, England does not collapse but rather pauses, a kingdom suspended between what has been and what is yet to come. The courtiers who once moved like shadows through the gilded halls of Whitehall now tread even more carefully, for while the tyrant is gone, the architecture of his rule remains intact. The great machinery Henry constructed, his laws, his church, his centralized power, continues grinding forward. But at its helm now sits a boy king, Edward, barely 9 years old, wide-eyed beneath the weight of a crown that once belonged to a man who commanded armies and redefined nations. The Regency Council, a hand-picked assembly of Henry's most trusted advisors, steps into the vacuum with cautious precision. These men, led by Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, balance both opportunity and danger. Somerset, Edward's uncle, seizes the role of Lord Protector and quickly assumes control over both court and kingdom. While young Edward studies scripture and governance under tightly controlled supervision, the council wastes no time in accelerating the reforms Henry had only cautiously allowed. No longer restrained by the former king's personal compromises, Somerset pushes England further toward Protestant doctrine. The Latin Mass is replaced by English services. Images of saints and relics are stripped from churches that had barely begun adjusting to Henry's previous mandates. Altars are dismantled. Stained glass windows depicting the Virgin and the saints are shattered, their broken fragments swept into piles of forgotten devotion. The religious revolution Henry had begun now barrels forward with renewed fervor, leaving both clergy and commoners disoriented by the relentless pace of change. Across the countryside, the remnants of Catholic loyalty still simmer. Secret gatherings persist, as priests loyal to the old ways conduct forbidden masses in barns and cellars, risking their lives to keep alive the faith that had once been the spiritual bedrock of the kingdom. Peasants whisper in dark corners, their voices laced with both fear and defiance, wondering if England's violent break from Rome might one day be reversed. But for now, the reformers hold the power. Somerset and his allies enforce the king's supremacy with unwavering zeal, deploying soldiers to quash any hint of rebellion before it can ignite. In the noble halls that once trembled under Henry's fury, new games of power unfold. Gregory Whitmore, having survived the dangerous final years of Henry's reign through calculated retreat and political obedience, finds himself once again among the most influential figures in court. His wealth remains staggering, his network of alliances extensive. But even Whitmore knows that the volatility of court politics under a boy king is not to be underestimated. Rivals emerge daily, eager to carve out their own dominance in the absence of the iron hand that once dictated every decision. Among them, old factions revive and reform. New conspiracies form like storm clouds on the horizon, and the machinery of ambition never ceases its grinding. Lord Percival, who once dreamed of restoring the old faith under Henry, watches from a distance calculating his next moves. Though his efforts under Henry were checked, the instability of a regency offers fresh hope. Across the seas, Catholic powers quietly observe, waiting to see if England's experiment in sovereignty might unravel under the strain of its own religious contradictions. The Pope, though diminished in power, still dreams of reclaiming England for the Mother Church, and emissaries continue their secret correspondence with sympathizers on English soil. In the streets of London, life for the common people remains harsh and unforgiving. The grandiose reforms of courtly religion bring little comfort to those struggling with poverty, hunger, and lawlessness. The loss of the monasteries continues to haunt rural communities, where once plentiful charity has been replaced by harsh vagrancy laws and merciless sheriffs. The rapid inflation caused by Henry's endless wars and extravagant spending leaves the price of bread out of reach for many. Vagabonds are rounded up and branded as criminals, while workhouses overflow with the displaced. The king's great social experiment, rooted in consolidation of power and wealth, has left a lasting wound across the very foundation of English society. And yet, even as discontent bubbles, a strange sense of national identity begins to take shape. A uniquely English identity forged in the fires of Henry's Revolution. No longer beholden to Rome, no longer fully Catholic, and not yet fully Protestant, England stands alone, proud, and increasingly aware of its distinctiveness. The common folk, while divided in faith, begin to adopt the notion that their kingdom is unlike any other, governed not by distant popes or emperors, but by their own sovereign, even if that sovereign now sits as a child beneath the heavy Tudor crown. As the years unfold, Edward's reign, though brief, will leave its mark. His health, like his mother Jane's, remains frail, and by his mid-teens, his body begins to fail. With Edward's decline, the precarious balance of power once again shifts dramatically. Somerset falls from grace, and new factions rise with dizzying speed. Whitmore's fortune fluctuates as he navigates each new turn with the same careful calculation that had kept him alive through Henry's many purges. Percival and the conservative factions seize new opportunities as the Regency Council fractures into bitter infighting. With Edward's death in 1553, the long-suppressed fury of England's Catholic loyalists explodes back into the center of power. Margaret, Henry's daughter by Eleanor, ascends the throne as Queen Margaret III. Unlike her brother's Protestant policies, Margaret wastes no time reasserting papal authority over England, her reign driven by a fiery zeal to undo the sins of her father. Heresy trials fill the prisons, and public burnings return to the town squares of London, as bishops and reformers who once flourished under Edward now face the flames. The pendulum swings violently in the opposite direction, as Margaret seeks to wash the kingdom clean with fire and fear. But history offers no peace for long. After only a few years, Margaret's health deteriorates, and with her death, the next chapter begins with the rise of Elizabeth, Henry's daughter by Annette. Under Elizabeth's reign, England will finally stabilize, forging an identity as a Protestant power distinct from Rome, yet careful not to replicate the brutal extremism of Margaret's persecution. Elizabeth's long and steady hand ushers in an era of cultural flowering and political cunning that will come to be remembered as one of England's greatest ages. But none of this would have been possible had it not been for the storm her father unleashed decades earlier. Henry's legacy does not fade with the passage of time. His impact echoes through every church, every law, and every family whose ancestors lived through the endless turbulence he created. His reign remains a monumental paradox. A king who shattered ancient institutions in the name of power, but who laid the foundation for the very stability his successors would build upon. He was ruthless and visionary, devout and blasphemous, beloved and despised. No monarch before or after would wield such unchecked authority or leave such a complicated mark upon England's soul. And now, dear listener, as we return from this journey into the twisted corridors of Tudor history, I invite you to reflect on this incredible story. If you've enjoyed walking through the tangled web of Henry's life, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Join our growing community as we explore more of history's most fascinating and sometimes terrifying chapters. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What surprised you most? Did you learn something new? Or maybe you have your own theories about Henry's true legacy. I would love to hear your stories, your insights, and your own personal connection to history. After all, it's in these conversations that the past comes alive again. Thank you for being part of this incredible journey. And until our next deep dive, take care, stay curious, and remember, history isn't just about the past. It's the mirror we carry into our future.